I've looked forward for 4 weeks now to be able to talk to you about my life verse. When I actually started the sermon preparation, I had mixed feelings. It surprised me. On the one hand, I wish all of you would choose this life verse to be your life verse. It's sturdy. It's inspirational. It calls the best out of you. It's challenging. It's comforting. So, on the one hand, I'm eager to unpack it and maybe persuade you, if you're still wondering what your life verse is, to take this as yours. On the other hand, what I was not anticipating is I got very emotional during my prep because I've been through a lot with this verse supporting my life. I mean, this verse kept me centered when almost every other force in my life seemed swirling out of control. This single verse has kept me anchored through some terrible storms that have come my way. This verse kept me going when I wanted to quit Willow at a couple points along the way and just leave it in my rear view mirror forever. But this verse wouldn't let me, and it would bring me back. This verse has rescued me from a life of narcissistic self-indulgence. More about that later. I could show you from my journal times when I was so forlorn that I couldn't even write out my feelings to God. I couldn't put words to the level of my dejection. And I could show you pages in my journal where all I could do to express myself to God was to write out this verse over and over and over again. So here it is, 1 Corinthians 15:58. Therefore, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your work is never in vain, if it is in the Lord. This is an awesome verse. I see that some of you are a little unconvinced, so in the next 90 minutes, I intend to convince all of you, if for no other reason than to get me to stop talking. So let's unpack it for a few moments. Obviously, the Apostle Paul penned this verse, and because the verse starts with a therefore, we need to understand what the therefore is. Therefore. Earlier in chapter 15 of 1 Corinthians, Paul is earnestly trying to convince his audience that because Jesus was resurrected from the dead, all human beings, every last one of them, will be resurrected as well the moment they die. In verse 52 of 1 Corinthians 15, he says, in a flash, in a twinkling of an eye, just immediately upon someone's death, they will awaken to a whole new reality. In verse 53, he says, the perishable will put on the imperishable, the mortal will put on immortality. But everyone, Paul says, is going to be resurrected to stand before God and give an account of their life. They're going to give an account of what they lived for, who they lived for, how they spent their one and only life. Quick side note. Today in 2012, if you lined up 100 people on the streets of downtown Chicago and you said, what do you think happens the minute you die? What happens? What unfolds next? A whole bunch of people would look at you and they would go, well, I think it's like this. Poof. My candle goes out. I cease to exist. I float in nothingness for the rest of time. A lot of people believe there is no resurrection on the other side, no standing before a holy God, no giving of an account for what they did with their life, no rewards, no consequences, just unconscious nothingness forever. That was the prevailing belief in Paul's day as well, to which Paul simply says in this passage, that's nonsense. That's totally untrue. That's not how it's going to go down. Everyone is going to be resurrected in the next reality. In 1 Corinthians 15:20, he says it interestingly. He says, Christ has indeed been raised from the dead. Here's the cool concept. First fruits of those who die. In an agrarian culture, everyone understood the first fruits idea. Let me quickly explain it to you. The first fruits idea is that if you have a field of corn and it's almost ready to be harvested, you find that one ear of corn that might be ready a day earlier than the rest of the crop, and you pick it and you celebrate its readiness, its color, its texture, its taste. You hold it up and you thank God for it, and you thank God for it in part because there's a whole crop out in the field just like it that you're going to start harvesting tomorrow and then the next day and the next day. The first fruit is a prototype that has a whole bunch that's going to happen in like manner later on. So Paul is saying, once Christ resurrected from the dead, he is the prototype with everyone to follow. He's the first fruits. And there's a whole field of people, everyone in humanity, that will be resurrected in like manner, consciously and immediately. Now stay with me for a second. The reason that Paul is just hammering away at the reality of the resurrection is because most of his listeners still believed in that poof, candle goes out theory of death. And if you follow that theory to its logical conclusion, the results are just staggering in that day and in our day. In short, life, if you think about it, loses its meaning altogether. Concentrate, Paul says. Think this through. If nobody is resurrected after death, why does anything in this life matter at all? Why don't we all, and then he quotes a secularist, why don't we all just eat, drink, and be merry? For tomorrow we die and then our candle goes out and then it's all nothingness. But Paul says that's not true, and it would lead to unbelievable chaos because it would lead to the conclusion that nothing matters in this life. Think with me. If the modern day sex trafficker who's making millions of dollars buying and selling little girls that horrific things are going to happen to. So that guy's doing that, making all of his money, and then he dies and poof, his candle goes out. And then Mother Teresa's candle went out when she died some years ago, and she served the poor for 70 years and tried saving little girls' lives. But both of them just go into nothingness, eternal nothingness. What does it matter, one way or the other, what they did with their lives? If there's no resurrection, the serial rapist and abuser or murderer enjoys the same quiet nothingness after death as the Martin Luther Kings, the Nelson Mandelas, and the Billy Grahams of this world. Paul said that is not what's going to happen. That's not how it's going to go down. Not in your life. Every human being will be resurrected and will stand before a holy God and a resurrected Jesus Christ, and they will give an account of their behaviors, their words, their deeds, and certainly their beliefs. Therefore, Paul says, in light of all of these resurrection realities, therefore, I'm asking you Christ followers to do some stuff. First, I'm asking you to be steadfast, absolutely immovable. He starts right there, and you're like, wow, steadfast about what? Steadfast, unmovable, immovable about what? Be steadfast in these core Christian beliefs that Jesus is who he said he was, that he died on a cross, an atoning death for the sins of the world, that God did raise him from the dead as a prototype, as first fruits that will result in everybody being resurrected and held accountable someday. Be immovable about that. When the whole culture around you is arguing for this candle going out theory, don't you buy it and don't budge an inch. Even if the whole culture is singing, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Don't buy that. Don't buy any part of it. Paul is saying to his listeners in that day and our day, you got to stay mentally tough. You got to stay focused intellectually, spiritually. You got to keep a hold of the core Christian beliefs. You got to be steadfast and immovable about this stuff. Time out. I want to tell you a couple things that I'm not proud of. And these few things will reveal to you in part why this has been my life verse for almost 40 years. Part of the reason I chose this verse to be my life verse is because of how tempting it is during certain phases or stages of my life, how tempting it is for me to fall into the eat, drink, and be merry mindset. More often than you would think, especially if I'm under tremendous pressure, I find myself wishing that I could just live for myself, that I could just indulge my desires and blow off my commitments and stop caring for the condition of this world. In darker moments, I want to break away from God. I want to do my own thing. I want to believe that my candle will just go out and it's all nothingness. In my dark moments, I want to spend money like a drunken sailor and not be a responsible Dutch guy. Sometimes I really wish that the candle theory were true, because then I wouldn't have to be so serious about so many things in this world. And as long as I'm telling you that, I might as well tell you the rest. But sometimes I wish the candle theory was true, because I wouldn't have to worry so much about my friends' lives and souls and their afterlives. That would make my life so much easier. I expend a lot of energy worrying and praying about the lives and the afterlives of people I care about, and frankly, sometimes I expend energy to try to help perfect strangers understand the message and the love of Christ. It would be so convenient, so unbelievably convenient, if I could simply believe that nothing exists beyond the grave, because that would take me off a hook that I've been hung on for 40 years. But this verse, and this is part of the reason I chose it, this verse just punches me right in the face every day. And it says, not you, Bill, not you. Don't you budge. Don't you fall into what the culture says, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. That's nonsense. Bill, you be steadfast. You be immovable. Don't let any of the culture's cries, don't let any circumstances that comes your way, don't let anything move you off the focus of resurrection realities. That people will stand before a holy God. Everyone will. And they'll give an account of their life, as will I. Never lose sight of that, this verse says. Let it drive your attitudes and your actions every day. So, full confession, part of the reason I chose this verse, part of the reason I love this verse, because I need a punch in the face every day. I need to be reminded to be steadfast and immovable, unpersuaded by the culture that I live in. Now, it's taken me about a week to work up the courage to say what I'm going to say to you next, and I say it with love. It's my observation that some of you, not all of you, certainly not all of you, but some of you have a quite low sense of urgency about the lives and the afterlives of people you say you love. I don't understand it. If there are people you love who are far from God, and you live with no sense of urgency about what's going to happen to them at the end, I just don't get it. You need a punch in the face. You need something to wake you up. And there are some of you that used to really live with urgency about this matter. I know some of you who run companies and you're leaders of departments in certain corporations or arenas of influence. I remember when some of you went to work and you thought, I can't wait to get to work because I can glorify God with my labors, but my co-workers are a mission field for me. They're people I can love. They're people I can show Christ to. I'm the pastor to the people that I work with. And you prayed for them, and you did everything in your power. You gave them CDs to listen to and all of that. You lived with a sense of urgency. And it's my observation. It's not an accusation. It's just an observation that some of you have lost some of that urgency, as I certainly would if I hadn't chosen this as a life verse, if I don't have it reverberating in my mind day in and day out. Be steadfast, be immovable. Don't get sucked in to the culture, and don't forget what's important and what matters and who matters. Easter's coming up. People are more open to resurrection realities around Easter than any time of the year. Are you risking anything to bring people with you? Do you have an invitation mentality? Are you walking around with radar spinning over your head saying, who would it be that I would be able to invite to come with me for Easter? Well, I love this verse. It just reminds me every day, be steadfast, be immovable about these core Christian beliefs. Keep your sense of urgency high. The second reason I love this verse and chose it as my life verse is because it calls the absolute best out of me. It's blindingly clear on its marching orders for my life. Always abound in the work of the Lord. Another translation says, always give yourself fully to the work of the Lord. It doesn't say, hey, if you ever get around to it in your otherwise busy life, whenever it's convenient for you, if you have absolutely nothing else you feel like doing, throw a bone to God. It doesn't say, hey, dabble once in a while in the work of the Lord. It doesn't say every once in a while get intense about it. It sets the bar about as high as it can be set. And I'm a guy who needs a high bar. Always, it says, always abound in the work of the Lord. Rain or shine, come what may. Every day, whether my biorhythms are right or how well the planets are aligned, doesn't matter. Always get up, put one foot in the other, and move the purposes of God forward in this world. Move them forward passionately. Move them forward strategically. Move them forward thoughtfully. But get up every day, always abounding in the work of the Lord. I need clarity like that. Every once in a while, people say, hey, is it possible that the Apostle Paul set the bar of expectation higher than Jesus even did? I don't think so. Look at Jesus' words in John 9:4. Work, he says, work, for the night is coming when no one will be able to work. I get this, gang. We are only on this earth for a season. And at my age, you start to realize how short the season really is. Actuarially, I'm in the fourth quarter of my life. And you go, wow, first 3 quarters went really fast. I still feel like a kid. But if I get 70 years, if I get 75 or 80 years, I'm in the fourth quarter. Jesus says you only get a certain amount of time. You only get a season to do my purposes in this world, to make a difference for the God you say you love. Work, for the night is coming. When the night comes, you can't work anymore. You'll never be able to advance the purposes of God like you can right here and right now with your one and only life. John 15:8, Jesus says, by this is my Father glorified, that you bear much fruit, not a smattering amount of fruit, much fruit. So Jesus and Paul, they see eye to eye on how quickly life passes. So abound, work, bear fruit, the night is coming. I was conducting an interview with Dallas Willard a few years ago. In my view, Dallas Willard is one of the great spiritual thinkers and writers of our day. After the formal interview was done, I asked Dallas if anything ever really gets him down. Because, as many of you know, he's a very optimistic and joy-filled man. I was not expecting him to answer my question so quickly. He didn't miss a beat, and he said, Bill, I'll tell you what gets me down. It bothers me that Christ followers require so much prompting and so much cajoling to do God's work in the world. He said, I'm with pastors a lot, and pastors have to beg people to read their Bibles. They have to beg people to pray. They have to beg people to use their spiritual gift. They have to plead with people to serve or volunteer in the church initiatives. Churches have to spend thousands of dollars producing emotional videos to move people to care for the poor, because if they didn't show them those kind of videos, they wouldn't care for the poor. And he just hung his head and he said, Bill, it just shouldn't have to be that way. The motivation should come from within. I could not agree more. More of the motivation for all of us ought to come from within. And sometimes when I meet self-motivated Christ followers, full on, fired up, take the hill for God, it doesn't surprise me that they are so, because they have a life verse that pushes them, that calls the best out of them, that challenges them every single day. So the fire comes from within. 1Corinthians 15:58 people don't require constant pep talks from pastors or pleadings from exhausted staff members to step up and get involved in the work of the Lord. Their life verse makes them eager to abound in the work of the Lord. All you have to do is show them where, show them the need. And they're like, hey, I'm already motivated. I got up this morning, and it said always abound in the work of the Lord. So today is like any other day. I'm going to work. I'm going out into the neighborhood. I'm going to school with an always abounding mindset. Just show me the way. Gang, in the moments right after you die, and that day's coming, don't kid yourself. In the few seconds right after you die, and you're immediately resurrected, like Paul says, boom, twinkling of an eye. In those moments, right after you're resurrected, you're going to be standing face to face with the God who created this whole thing, the God who breathed life into you, the God who loves you. You're going to meet him face to face. And if you look just to his right, you're going to see the resurrected Jesus Christ with a smile on his face because he's glad you're there. And you'll notice his nail prints in his hands and feet. Just think about that for a second. A few seconds after you die, that's what we're all going to experience. And in those awesome moments, when this all gets clear to you what's happening, you'll fully grasp that the whole world was God's. And the most important thing going on in the world you lived in were the purposes of God. You'll see it clearly then. And in those moments, you will be so unbelievably grateful that you abounded in the work of the Lord with your one and only life. You'll be so glad that you lived for him and you loved him and you worshiped him and you served him with joy and you spread his fame and you lifted up his name to everyone who would listen. And maybe for just a nanosecond, you'll grasp at how horrible it would be to stand before this awesome God and to hang your head and admit that during your one and only shot at life on earth, your main thing was to eat, drink, and be merry, or your main thing was to chase money or power or pleasure or fashion or self-gratification. You just go, oh my gosh, if I would have done that, oh, the self-regret would just be unbelievable. But I'll phrase it again positively. In those moments, when you first stand before God and see Jesus, you will be so glad for abounding in his work, advancing his purposes in his strength for his glory. You will be so glad you gave this your best shot. Which leads me to my third and final reason why I have made this my life verse. The final phrase in this little text gives me enormous comfort because it simply says, knowing, if you're abounding, you can know that your work, the efforts that you're putting into this whole thing, it is never in vain if it is in the Lord. Those three words, never in vain. Would you say them with me? Never in vain. One more time. Never in vain. The way I'm wired up, I detest doing stuff in vain. Spurious activities drive me crazy. An excavator friend of mine many years ago spent 3 days digging out a guy's backyard to install an in-ground swimming pool. And when he had got it all done, 3 days of effort, perfectly dug out, ready for the pool company to come and do their part, the homeowner came back from vacation, saw the hole in his backyard, and said to the excavator, "I didn't order a swimming pool. What address were you supposed to dig at?" Yup, the excavator had missed it by one house. He had dug the hole one house to the left. So he had to fill it all back in. He had dug that hole in vain. I hate doing things in vain. I don't even like getting my hair cut because it's just going to grow back. And it's going to cost me $8. You know, I go to student barbers. Our newest grandkid, 5-month-old Mac, was having some stomach issues the other night, and I told Lynn I wasn't going to change one more diaper because it was just in vain. He was just going to load them up again, so it was done. I hate doing things in vain, which is part of the reason why I chose this as my life verse, because it reminds me that every single thing I do to advance the purposes of God in this world, no matter how big or how small, how visible or how invisible, it is never in vain. That means so much to me. Everything I do to advance the purposes of God is noticed and appreciated by God. Every prayer prayed, every gift given, every kind deed or act of service, every sermon well preached, every time zone crossed somewhere trying to help a church, it's all observed, it's all affirmed, it's all recorded on the ledger sheets of heaven, and it will be rewarded richly by God someday. I just love that it's never in vain. It motivates me as I attempt to always abound in the work of the Lord. What keeps me going is that I know it's never in vain. This kind of thing motivated the Apostle Paul as well. A few pages earlier in the book of 1Corinthians, chapter 9, to be specific, Paul says, think for a second of how much effort, how much training. Think of all the blood, sweat, and tears that go into an Olympian's attempt to win a running race. Enormous effort, a huge investment of time and energy. And if she wins the race, or if he wins, all they'll have to show for it, Paul says, is a perishable wreath. In those days, instead of getting gold medals for winning first place in an Olympic sport, a crown made of pine or olive leaves would be placed on the winner's head. And those pine leaves or olive leaves would begin wilting and deteriorating within hours of it being put on a winner's head. And so Paul says, think about all of the energy and the effort, and they get a perishable, wilting wreath that will be gone in just a few days. And then he says, now I want you to contrast that with running a different kind of race. I want you to think about running a race that advances the purposes of God in this world. I want you to think about running a race to spread the love of Jesus Christ to the whole world. I want you to run a race to feed the hungry before they lose hope or die. I want you to think about running a race to provide shelter for the homeless and clothes for the naked. I want you to think about running a race that will establish and strengthen churches all over the world so that they can bring hope to this lost planet. Paul says, if you enter that race and you run it hard, and it will be hard. You'll have to put as much training as if you were doing an Olympian sport. If you run that race, though, the kingdom race, and you run it hard, he says, at the end, you will not get an imperishable wreath that wilts in a day or two. God will give you this crown that lasts forever. It will be awesome. It will never fade. It will never wilt. And it will represent his approval and his joy at how you spent your one and only life. So Paul just says, what kind of crown do you want, gang? Do you want a perishable, wilting in 3 days crown? Or do you want an eternal, imperishable wreath or crown? And then he says, hey, are you in the right race? Are you running the right race? Or is the race you're running pretty much mostly in vain? If you're running for men's applause, can I give you a hint? It doesn't last long. I speak from experience. Men's applause doesn't last long. If you're running the race for material gain, it can rust, rot, depreciate, evaporate in a recession. You can't take it with you when you go. If you're running the race for passing pleasures, you just got to keep running harder because the pleasure hits required are more and more and more. Paul pleads, don't get to the end of your one and only life and find out that it was pretty much all in vain. Do not get to the end of your one and only life and realize you dug a swimming pool in the wrong backyard. That it was all in vain. Don't let that happen. Please, Paul says, please. Rather, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your work is never in vain if it is in the Lord. Now, I want to close by acknowledging it is a huge challenge to stay focused on the kingdom race when almost everybody in and around your life is full-on focused on the earthly race. It's tough to keep these races straight and to stay entered in the right one. A couple decades ago, there was a man I knew who had the spiritual gift of giving. The spiritual gift of giving is when God allows you the capacity to earn a lot of money. He motivates you to live on much less so that you can resource important causes in the kingdom. That's the spiritual gift of giving. Some of you have it, and this guy had it, and he took it with tremendous seriousness. He couldn't preach. He couldn't sing in the choir. He couldn't do any other stuff, but he knew he had that gift. And so rather than